Welcome to Reinventors and the Reinvent America series. I'm Peter Leiden. I'm the host of the series and the founder of Reinventors. Reinventors is using this new medium of interactive group video to do things that we haven't been able to do before. And what we routinely do now is we pull together innovators from around the country and the world to come together and work on solving complex problems. These are working sessions, working on real problems, and it's really not a show. Now, in this sake, we're basically, this series, the Reinvent America series, we are really working on the problems of, like, how do we actually get America's technology foundation right in a way that actually everyone, all Americans, actually can thrive in the years ahead. And we're doing this with our partners in this, T4A.org. T4A.org is a relatively new organization of top technologists, entrepreneurs based in Silicon Valley, San Francisco, and Seattle, who are really working on how do we improve the private sector, public sector kind of divide and communication between that to really, again, work on these long-term problems and get that technology foundation right. This week, we're going to be working on a really complex one. How do we really reinvent net neutrality? And the way we've been thinking about this is, for so long, the internet communities or technology communities writ large essentially have been just reacting to proposals from Washington to change anything in the status quo around the internet, basically, internet policy. And again, we're in one of these situations where, yet again, there's a reaction to a current proposal by the telecommunications companies to actually figure out a two-tier system in which you basically could stream digital content two different speeds. There'd be a little fast lane that those to pay more. Now, there's been a big backlash to that, but what we want to do is, instead of saying no, again, although that's an incredible perspective, is what's the positive, what's the kind of longer-term strategy of actually solving this net neutrality issue once and for all? Now, one of the ways to do this is to think, should we treat the internet like a public utility? Should we, in other words, to keep equal access for all? Now, on the surface of it, it's kind of a reasonable thing to think about. Isn't the internet as vital to modern life as the telephone or electricity and others that have been kind of in this kind of public utility category of the 20th century? But on the other hand, there's other ways to maybe do this, ensure net neutrality with less regulation and less not going that route. So what we basically want to do today is we want to take advantage of this FCC comment period surrounding this kind of proposal, the two-tier kind of proposal, to actually look at really bring a strategy session together, almost like a meeting of the minds here, and what is like a proactive, long-term kind of way to actually ensure this net neutrality issue in the long run. How do we solve this the wrong way? And then also to think about what is the strategy, and maybe that is the public utility. We're going to look hard at, is that one of the options to really push hard at? But also the thing is, what's the strategy now in this short period here to actually try to shift this conversation? And do what we can in this kind of period, but also to look long-term on what's the strategy to really solve this issue once and for all. And to do this, we've actually brought a fantastic group together in general, but we got an anchor for this conversation is Clay Shirky. Clay is going to kind of start the conversation, and you can't think of a better person from my point of view to actually start this conversation. Clay's a well-respected, extremely well-respected public intellectual. I think of him on all the issues around, or many of the issues around internet technologies. He's the author of a couple of terrific books. Here Comes Everybody, Cognitive Surplus, both terrific. He's also a professor at NYU University, and anyhow, he's going to start this off. But the great thing about Reinvent is it's not about one person and their idea. It's really about the diverse mixture of different perspectives. And for that, we've got really anyone in this roundtable could have been the anchor. And so what we're going to do right now is go around the roundtable and just say, have everyone introduce themselves and say a little bit about what they bring to the table in regards to this issue. So, Brian, do you want to kind of start? Just jump in.
Sure. Hi, so I'm Brian Behlendorf. I'm a managing director at Mithril Capital Management. I've got a background that spanned a bunch of different things, from having started a whole bunch of different startups to working in DC at the White House for a little bit, to being a CTO at the World Economic Forum, and as well being on the board of many different nonprofit organizations, some of whom, such as Mozilla and the Electronic Frontier Foundation, have been very focused on the net neutrality debate, both historically and even very recently. And so coming from all these different backgrounds, I'm very sympathetic to the notion that there is a public utility kind of nature to what we do, that this is about human rights, that this is, you know, about freedom of expression and access to thinking, that actually goes all the way back to the earliest days of the internet, the presumption that every TCP packet had a right to be able to get from its source to its destination, right? I wish the public utilities had a better reputation when it comes to managing essential functions. People tend not to think very favorably of their public utilities out there. So I think in thinking about this, we might need to ask what can we do to actually drive the consumer, not just demand for this, because I think that's there, I think that's implicit, but also how do we inform them when they are victims of abuses of net neutrality, like the recent move that Verizon has made. I'm sorry, that Netflix made, notifying Verizon users that they might be seeing some congestion on their connections due to Verizon's practices themselves. But I think also ultimately we need to ask, what do we do to really get more competition in the last mile, and get consumers to feel engaged and have the ability to influence this, you know, to actually affect the vendors, and I think that means being helping consumers be multi-homed in how they get their bandwidth, not just from one cable but from multiple different sources, so that they can route around any problem, which is what originally was the architecture of the net, being able to route around censorship. I think it might also mean civic ownership or neighborhood level ownership of the last mile. It's very distressing to see. States start to push this. So I just wanted to give that opening statement, and very happy to be a part of this.
Yeah, you're jumping right into the conversation here. So let's just at this stage, let's just go around and introduce a little bit of what you bring to the table and who you go. But good intro, thanks. But let's just keep going around. Anna, do you want to do a quick intro and just where you're coming from?
Sure. So I'm Anna Galland. I'm an organizer. I'm the executive director of MoveOn.org Civic Action. What I bring to this, I think, very important discussion is my connection to MoveOn's incredible membership of 8 million Americans around the country who just want to see our country be a place where everyone can thrive. And net neutrality matters to that because, in fact, it's not just a sort of wonky discussion. This is an issue about the control of the flow of information in our democracy. It's related to fights over privatization, fights about good government, fights even about income inequality and economic inequality more broadly. I think that handing over public services to private corporations in Wall Street is generally something that our members are skeptical of. So they are concerned about the creation of slow lanes in the internet. And they are excited about the fight to treat the internet like a public utility or a public resource like water or like open roads that anyone can use. It's really inspiring to see what we've already done in this fight. More than 10,000 of our members submitted personal stories about how their lives and livelihoods are dependent on an open internet, which are just incredible. You can see them at moveon.org/savetheinternet. And they turned up at over 20 local FCC offices around the country last month in remote office parks that had never seen a rally, I believe, in their existences on this earth. So this is a big fight. I'm glad to bring the voice of MoveOn members to this discussion with the rest of this terrific panel. Looking forward to the conversation.
Great, Doug. Why don't you introduce yourself, where you're coming from a little bit, and then we'll finish up here with Craig and Marvin in a minute. Go ahead.
Sounds great. Yeah, happy to be here. So I'm Doug Brake with the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation. So we're a public policy, educational research institution in Washington, D.C., focused on policies to promote innovation and that would drive productivity and economic growth. So I feel like, at least with the sort of policies that we've advocated for on this position, I feel like I might be a little bit of the odd one out on this issue. Generally somewhat skeptical that net neutrality regulation is quite as necessary as some have put out there. We've advocated for something of a middle ground, very similar to Wheeler's proposed approach. And I'm fairly skeptical that the Title II sort of utility-style regulation is something that's necessary to protect the open internet or protect net neutrality generally. So happy to be a part of this discussion, and very much looking forward to talking about these issues.
No, and we're happy to have you here, and really do want a perspective on what is the right way through, and we're looking forward to that. Craig, do you want to introduce yourself, although many people know you. How would you introduce yourself?
Craig Newmark. I'm a customer service rep at a company I founded called Craigslist. I'm also the nerd in residence at the Department of Veterans Affairs. I'm not all that smart, so my focus is on the issues that people typically forget, with frankly a little bit of libertarian pragmatist flavor. Specifically, people forget that a lot of this happening, getting real, depends on how much you trust the companies involved. And the deal is that the need is to remind them that they're making all their profits using public property, airwaves and rights of way, and we need to ensure that they're good tenants of our property, and that that requires not so much regulation as just having the FCC write a good contract. And if that contract is under the aegis of Title II, whatever works, works for me.
Great to have you here. Marvin, do you want to, I'm glad you just got in here, and we're looking forward to your point of view. Introduce yourself and just a short little introduction and what you bring to the conversation here.
Sure. So I'm a lawyer. I've worked on net neutrality issues since about 2005. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Since about 2005, I was the lawyer who brought the case against Comcast when they were interfering with BitTorrent. And most recently, I'm on the board of a group called Engine Advocacy, which advocates for startups and in favor of tech entrepreneurship in DC. And I helped organize a letter last month that had about 150 companies on it in favor of net neutrality. Everyone from Google, Amazon, Microsoft, Kickstarter, Etsy, down through a lot of startups from Y Combinator, Stanford, etc. And they're all sort of speaking the tech industry view from what I could see in favor of non-discrimination, in favor of a rule that sort of keeps the internet as it has always been, without discrimination, without tolls, and as a lawyer, sort of understanding the legal decisions in this area, there's no way to get there without Title II, and so we can try to find a creative compromise of sorts. But if we do anything other than Title II, discrimination will be required, access fees are required, and that's what the chairman is proposing, and that's why it's a problem.
Well, good. So we've had not only just the introductions, but everyone's kind of positioned, their positioning and where they're coming from and what they're excited about. This is great to see. Clay, why don't you kind of set the table for the conversation for the rest of the session here with some of your thoughts on this really complex problem and kind of unwinding it the way you've been thinking about it.
Sure. I mean, one of the things that I've been thinking about is in light of the SOPA PIPA protests of about a year and a half ago, where we saw that, in fact, there was a large constituency for these kinds of issues that could have a real political effect. And I've been thinking about why the net neutrality issue, which is in a way more fundamental, certainly deeper in the stack than SOPA PIPA, why it's hard to do some of that same kind of political organizing. And I want to throw out three of those problems. I have my own sense of what needs to happen, but I want to start by just saying what it is I think that makes this issue hard. The first thing is that it's boring, right? It is an issue that seems like it is about, in an almost literal way, plumbing, and it is difficult, although as we know from John Oliver, not impossible, but difficult to get the average citizen worked up about it, particularly when it seems like a sort of a Goliath versus Goliath fight when it's presented in its Comcast and Comcast versus Amazon streaming or Comcast versus Netflix mode. And so part of this, I think, is the framing. With SOPA PIPA, as long as it was about essentially, file sharing, yes or no, there wasn't a significant constituency. But once people looked at the law and saw that it was about establishing essentially an alternate court system for removing certain classes of social media from the network, then we had an audience for it. So I think that it's certainly the case that people who understand what happens at the router understand why this issue is as critical as it is. But the people who understand what goes on the router wouldn't fill Yankee Stadium, right? The outreach, I think, essentially has to explain to people why this is important in ways that are more capacious than the language we inherited from net neutrality, back when this really was a kind of a technocratic fight. The second difficult thing is that the tools that are often to hand for political mobilization on the internet are populist, and they are targeted at the legislature and at legislation, which was, again, perfect for SOPA PIPA. This issue, the net neutrality issue, is technocratic and economic. This is not about convincing people's representatives and senators. It's not even really about convincing the president, although that would help. It's about convincing Tom Wheeler, who is as head of the FCC, in a position that is specifically designed to be shielded from political pressure. And this is one of the oddities of the U.S. system, is that we can create these kind of technocratic regimes, whether it's the Federal Reserve or the Federal Communications Commission or what have you. And yet within the technocratic regimes, incredibly important political questions come up. From my point of view, I study the internet and social action. I'm less concerned with the loss of net neutrality on its effect on the cost of moving video from A to B, and more concerned with the idea that if discrimination becomes a normal part of managing network traffic, that the political ramifications of that will be negative for democracy. But the tools we have, essentially mass in the street, write your congressperson, don't actually have much purchase here. And when you go through and you read some of the letters that people are sending in the FCC comment period, we're already up at about 82 or 83,000 letters, but many of them are single sentence comments that essentially say don't regulate the internet or leave the internet alone, which as a sentiment seems pretty much in the direction of not allowing for discriminatory carriage costs. But the way it's phrased, it makes it look like the people writing don't even understand that the net is already regulated, that it always will be regulated. It's really just a choice between regulatory regimes. If this was a legislative fight, if this is a fight over counting votes on the floor of the House, those kinds of comments might be counted. But since they're addressed to a technocratic body, it seems to me that it might have been better if those comments had not gone in, because it's certainly not going to be terribly persuasive to Wheeler relative to hearing from, say, businesses whose loss will be significant if the network starts adding these extra fees. And then the third thing that worries me is that the internet's the thing we're good at, and it's certainly the thing we were good at with SOPA PIPA, is large-scale, short-term, unpredictable mobilization. Right? Certainly in New York, Senator Gillibrand and Senator Schumer were very surprised to find 1,000 people standing out in the cold in the middle of January, castigating them for their support for those bills. But if we lose on this, if we lose on September 10th and again in December, as is certainly at the very least possible, we still have to be fighting for the principles of net neutrality, even in a reduced circumstance. And I'm wondering, even as we're having to figure out our 90-day plan, what our 5-year plan is, because that also is going to leave us. If we get through this and Wheeler doesn't change his mind and it passes through Congress unmolested, dawn of 2015, we have a world in which the basic end-to-end principle has been damaged, but we still will have to fight for reasonable application so that random discrimination at will by any company that gets a piece of the working network doesn't become the norm. And I'm hopeful that we can find some ways to find some long-term strategies as well, so that whatever happens in this phase, we're ready for the continued fight. Because certainly, and especially from the cable company's point of view, there is no business model more attractive than essentially taxing use of the internet at both ends. And if that comes to pass, we will then have really a kind of ongoing and persistent fight that we don't, to my eye, look ready to have right now.
Terrific. Is that kind of, are you done there? Clay, I didn't want to.
Yes, yeah, no, absolutely.
Totally interesting. 3 great points. You know, before we kind of roll into specific questions, people want to just kind of any reaction to what Clay's laying out there? Does anyone want to just jump in there and give immediate thoughts? Go ahead.
This is Craig, and I've spoken to folks at FCC, and I can say that a lot of them want to do what I would consider the right thing, that is enforcing a social contract. They need the political cover to do that, which means they need some better message framing and delivery. Being simple-minded, I just remind them, like a lot of people, I love TV, and we've already seen that we have some reason not to trust the ISPs and telecoms, not to interfere with our enjoyment of TV, say delivered by Netflix. A simple-minded argument, but if I wanted to stir up a whole bunch of Americans, I might be tempted to say that.
Terrific. Doug, did you want to just, Doug, you want to jump in?
Yeah, just a few points. I mean, I think the way Clay frames it up is absolutely right. It's difficult because it's a very sort of technocratic debate that's way down in the weeds when you really get into it, and to try to have this big, much broader sort of public discourse about it is very difficult. Though that said, I'm concerned that a lot of what Chairman Wheeler initially put out there was misinterpreted in the press. I'm sure Marvin disagrees, and we can get into the legal details, but I think that his initial proposal can very much do all the work that we want to protect the sort of open internet. And to be honest, I mean, Peter, with your initial introduction, I think the notion that the FCC has put forward a proposal that is a two-tiered internet, or that necessarily requires these sorts of things that we're worried about, I'm not sure is a fair characterization. And so I think that if we can look at Wheeler's proposal and the sort of to get down into the legal jargon, but the jurisdiction of 706 under Title I, I think can do all the work that we need it to. And I worry that a lot of the sort of broader public discourse might not appreciate all those nuances, and we end up getting caught up in this debate over slogans, over fast lanes and slow lanes, that I'm not sure is accurately what the real technocratic stuff is really about. So I absolutely agree with the analysis of the problem, but I think that the solution might be a little bit different.
Anna, did you want to jump in also? Marvin, Marvin, go ahead. It sounds like you want to, because you were specifically talking about your position. Do you want to just, you got to
Sure.
unmute though.
Happy to. I have two thoughts. One thought on how boring this issue is, and the other on what 706 can do and can't do. So, I always thought this, I've worked on this issue for 10 years, and this is the first time that, average people have talked to me about it. Sort of know what it is and know what net neutrality is. There was a 13-minute segment on John Oliver about this recently that was viewed by 3 million people. Millions of people have filed comments. And so this is no less or more complicated than SOPA. During the SOPA fight, I remember a lot of the lawyers having to analyze exactly what the language meant, exactly how many foreign companies would be affected, exactly how the DNS provisions and the search engine provisions, how it all worked together. And the public messaging was, this will break the internet. And now the public messaging is, fairly accurately actually, this will create fast lanes and slow lanes. So, there are a lot of stories that I think aren't being told that will be. But when you ask, Kickstarter or Etsy or Tumblr or Meetup or the New York Tech Meetup, why they've come to DC, why they've done essentially trips to visit the FCC and talk about net neutrality. It's not just video streaming, right? It's sort of impacts on their businesses that are completely unintended that affect a lot of the companies we sort of love, that are the next generation of great high-growth companies. And then as for the chairman's initial proposal and the chairman's actual proposal that he put out, simply can't ban discrimination. It's a proposal that says we're going to have, we'll call it the slow lane, but there's going to be a certain minimum amount of speed or technical ability that every website gets. And then in addition to that, the carriers can discriminate, and they can also charge people for that discrimination. They can charge people to be in the faster lane. That's clearly the tentative conclusion in the proposal that's put forward. And under the decision in January, that's actually the best the chairman can do under Section 706. It's not like he's taking 706 and making it worse. The best he can do is authorizing technical discrimination, authorizing fast lanes. There are a few things that he could have done a little better, like extending the rule to mobile a little more aggressively, and also covering sort of interconnection points. But the actual rule around net neutrality was the very best he can do. And the only backstop he's sort of put forward is something called a standard of commercial reasonableness. And so it's not a standard around non-discrimination. The idea is if you're a startup or a tech company or somebody who's offered a deal by Comcast or Verizon, sort of discriminatory deal, if you don't think it's a reasonable deal, all you can do is file a complaint at the FCC or ask the ombudsman at the FCC to file a complaint against Verizon or AT&T or Comcast, huge companies. If you're a startup, you have one lawyer if you're lucky, probably zero. And the standard is so vague that it's essentially like bringing an antitrust style suit against Microsoft in the 90s. You have to prove harm to consumers, harm to competition, harm to civic innovation. It's the opposite of a rule that gives people certainty. And what I think startups really want, especially smaller companies, is to not have to pay fees to the carriers, not have to negotiate particular deals with Comcast and AT&T and eventually Deutsche Telekom and France Telecom to get to be in the in a fast lane. And I think they don't want to have to hire an army of lawyers to try to figure out an antitrust suit. They just want to know, am I being treated differently than my competitors and everyone else on the web? And that's a much easier question.
Clay, we're going to get to Anna in a second here, but Clay, you had a question that's kind of fleshing this out between really what Marvin and Doug is saying.
Yeah, well,
let's kind of clarify this. I think it's good without getting too bogged down in too much technicality here. It's probably worth this too.
That's exactly it. I mean, Marvin, in his initial reaction, suggested that he thought the fast and slow lane model wasn't an accurate characterization of what the FCC was able to achieve under 706.
Doug said that rather.
I'm sorry. No, right. I'm sorry. Doug said that, and then Marvin characterized this as being an inherently two-lane solution. So I was curious to hear from Doug as an affirmative. What is the right characterization of a non-Title II version of internet regulation around bandwidth and access?
So I see the two as being a fight over what jurisdictional grounds we choose to use, and really in substance not being all that different. I think Marvin and others have really seized on this particular notion that 706 would require negotiations to be individualized, that we would have to see some sort of individually negotiated terms under any sorts of agreements. But I think it's really important that we look at the actual language of the Verizon decision. And if you see the grounds on which the court gave the FCC this sort of new opening of jurisdiction, it's all about any sorts of harm that would be done to consumers or to competition. If we see any sort of degradation on edge providers, if we see anything bad that happens to edge providers that would reduce consumer demand, then the FCC has clear authority to step in and stop it. And I would also disagree with Marvin's last point. I don't think this is about setting up allowing any of these negotiations to go forward, any fast lane or slow lane deals to go forward, and then having consumers come bring a case in order to try to prove that this is not commercially reasonable. I think the court makes it very clear that the FCC has the jurisdiction to set up rules up front that defines what is and what isn't commercially reasonable. If you look at the NPRM that eventually came out, there are very interesting questions about rebuttable presumptions, what the FCC could set up as inherently not commercially reasonable and could not be done. And so I think that there's a lot of room to work with under 706, and I honestly think it's unfortunate the way that Wheeler's initial proposal was spun in the press to say that this is inherently fast lanes and slow lanes. So I think that there's plenty of room to work with on both sides, either Title II or the 706, and I think 706 can do all the work that we need it to without a lot of the blowback and the problems that could come along with Title II.
But won't it be in practice fast lanes and slow lanes? I mean, it seems to me the one thing the FCC could not do with commercially reasonable is they could never say no additional charges for access to a faster bandwidth. They couldn't outlaw additional charges for access to faster bandwidth. And given the Comcast Netflix deal, would we not in practice see essentially that commercial reasonableness would set a price for the fast lane but would not prevent the fast lane from coming into existence, thereby effectively rendering rest of internet as the slow lane?
So I think there are two separate issues here that might be getting muddled together a little bit. There's the Comcast Netflix deal that you referred to, and I think that, I mean, that's an issue of interconnection, absolutely an important question, but I think it's a little bit different, at least analytically, from the net neutrality issue that we're talking about. And so, I mean, this very quickly gets into the weeds of the technology stuff, but I think that there would be room, at least for the FCC, to possibly set up rules against setting up a fast lane and slow lane with regard to bandwidth. But there are all sorts of different metrics, by which we measure the sort of needs of an application, of particular packets of application. And so I would argue that in some situations, like very latency-sensitive applications. I mean, take for example this Google Hangout. If we want to have a high bandwidth, very latency-sensitive application, I think that prioritization in that sort of situation makes an awful lot of sense. I mean, that's definitely a room for disagreement there, but I think that it's at least the position of our organization that there are situations where prioritization, at least in terms of like stuff like latency and packet loss and jitter, could make an awful lot of sense.
But I don't think anyone would deny that. I mean, routers have always dumped UDP packets before TCP packets. I mean, the very difference between UDP and TCP assumes that logic from the beginning, and certainly net neutrality in its Tim Wu-esque framing says prioritization by classes of packet or class of application is essentially part of what allows the network to operate. Yep. I think that the reason I brought up the Marvin?
Yeah, so the way the FCC decided this issue in 2010, and they went sort of the Barbara von Scheivik route more than the Tim Wu route, was they banned application-specific discrimination. There's a presumption against it. And so the idea was that if you had to discriminate, and because some user was using a lot of video, etc., you could discriminate based on that user, but not single out certain applications and prioritize them ahead of others. And so that tends to be the standard, that the way to respond to the need to, the way to respond to congestion and to prioritizing video. Like what we really should do is just add capacity rather than single out certain applications for increased benefits. And the reason why is because there should be capacity invested across the board, and we shouldn't give companies an incentive to congest their networks so that they can extract revenue to charge the few to actually work well. But go on, Clay. I just wanted to clarify that one point.
No, that's. Hang on. Did I mute myself? No, I'm unmuted. All I was going to say, and you're right about that, and thank you, Marvin. All I wanted to say about the Comcast Netflix deal is that I think that shows us in practice what will happen, and that the FCC might have the ability to regulate on a case-by-case basis every individual deal. They would be operating with, I think, less freedom to prevent those deals from the start, but also, as we've seen with the SEC, which also has presumptive regulatory access, that when everything has to be negotiated on a case-by-case basis, it's simply harder to stand on principle. And it seems to me the principle Marvin is articulating, which is a principle of non-discrimination, which has been part of the etiquette at the router since the end-to-end paper was published, even if it has not always been enforced in code. It's simply been the way people have agreed to manage the network. To lose the ability to ask for that on principle is already a huge change. There are certainly things the FCC could do within a 706 world to make it better or worse, but I think the Comcast Netflix deal shows us a lot of what's going to happen if we end up in this world. And then I think Anna, we jumped over Anna, so.
Yeah, let's go to Anna. But this is all good. It was a good little technical segue there that we kind of got to. Anna, though, jump in.
Sure. So as the non-technologist or the non-sort of policy expert, I'll say it seems to me that rules that allow for hugely well-funded telecommunications lobbyists to sort of weigh in case by case are much more perilous for the overall outcomes than simple sort of undergirding principles that we set in place up front. Within that context, I wanted to say, MoveOn members are starting from the place that we need to treat the internet like a public utility, that we need to regulate it as a sort of an essential public commons that we need to preserve for our future of our democracy and our economy. It can't turn into fast lanes and slow lanes. And I wanted to sort of offer that it's not just a discussion, the discussion that we're having here and the impact on consumers and citizens is not just about how fast Netflix videos play. Although, yes, that's important, and we should be talking about that as organizers who are trying to help people understand, what this debate is about. But it's actually also about groups like MoveOn that have benefited from a free and open and equal internet, and our counterparts on the other side of the political spectrum as well. We have benefited from an open internet without fast lanes and slow lanes. I think that's incredibly important for the future and health and vibrancy of our democracy, because our civic sector is going to look a lot more like MoveOn in the next 10 years, and next generations of MoveOn, Upworthy, which we incubated and spun out, and other groups, and less like the old bricks and mortar nonprofits that use direct mail to communicate with their supporters. And we will all do better. We will have a better public conversation about where our country is going if we're treating all the internet traffic over which groups like ours are communicating the same, and don't create slow lanes where we will innovate less quickly. The cost of doing business for a group like us will go up. So that's an important consideration, I think. I think that the stakes here are not just the way in which our economy functions and the way that different kinds of companies sort of interact and who's making what profit margins. It's actually also about the whole civic sector that's so important for how we as a society move forward. And then one other more narrow point or comment, I really appreciated how Clay noted that one challenge to the net neutrality discussion is that this is essentially a technocratic debate or fight where a group of unelected folks are making a key decision about our future. However, I would note, at least in the short term, there is someone who is democratically elected who has a key role to play, who has not weighed in forcefully yet, and that is President Obama. And that is a reason that you will see so many activists and MoveOn members, yes, directing our comments at FCC commissioners and those 20 local FCC offices in remote office parks that I mentioned, and to the tens of thousands of comments that are pouring in, but also why we are pouring calls in daily right now to the White House, to President Obama, and why we are working with allies to deliver petitions to President Obama, along with Credo and Free Press and others, because in fact, given his campaign promises and given his status as the person who appoints the guys that run the FCC, his opinion here and his public comment is incredibly important. So we do have an organizing handle. It's a bank shot, but it's a real organizing handle, and I think we need to seize it.
Terrific. Brian.
So to contribute very minimally to the wonk side of the conversation in the room, Mozilla submitted comments to the FCC that suggested a reframing perhaps of this that others may find useful, and that was to think of not just the ISPs and the end users as having a stake in this and having to kind of define their relationship, whether that's under Title II or whatever, but also thinking about the data service providers who are providing end services, everybody from Google and Dropbox to individuals to people running websites of all sorts. And the proposal was to consider whether these remote delivery services that the ISPs are essentially performing as services for the data providers, consider those telecommunication services. And this sounds like an interesting hack at one level. It's something that potentially gives the FCC a route around some of the more thorny issues around classifying a lot of this as Title II. But I just wanted to throw it out there and draw some attention to it amongst the other folks in this room, because I think it's worth discussing. But back certainly to Anna's point and to Clay's point about that this does feel like a boring issue. I do think we need to be cognizant of the fact that there is a difference between blocking and slowing when it comes to content. I think it's very easy to detect when there's a website that's denied because you haven't paid for the premium package, which gives you fantastic access to services like Netflix. That's something that's easy to rile some anger around. What's more pernicious and potentially more damaging, but harder to address, is the slowdowns, right? When Netflix is throttled, or the perception is that Netflix is slowed down to users of Comcast or Verizon, it may only be as obvious as somebody only being able to get a standard definition or low definition viewing of Orange is the New Black rather than the high def like they prefer. But the reality is that when you slow down, say, a web page, right, and it takes 5 seconds to load rather than 1 second, that's not that much different than blocking it. And yet, it'd be really difficult to sit here and say, latency and packet loss and other things are regulatorily mandated to be within certain limits, right? And it could be something as, rather than an overt action on the part of somebody like a Comcast in terms of setting up a block, it's something that's kind of covert and an indication of not enough investment in an interconnect. The fact is we do have tools to try to detect these things. And like I mentioned in the intro, I think it was really fascinating to see Netflix call out specifically Verizon when they were detecting congestion there. But I do think as we think about the policymaking on the side, we need to really be cognizant of these two different classes of threats to net neutrality and make both of them relevant to end users.
Hey, Craig, thanks, Brian. That's terrific. Craig, jump in.
Folks, it sounds like we're talking about two different approaches to get to this desirable goal of a level playing field, because remember, that's the kind of values that that people like, and it's the people that own the resources that the telecoms use to make some money. And right now it appears that Title II regulation allows us to form the kind of rules according to that social contract which minimize our reliance on telecoms and ISPs to be trustworthy. The bottom line here is that telecoms and ISPs pretty much routinely break promises. They have done a lot of deceptive stuff when it comes to talking about the relationship between Comcast and Netflix and Verizon. Even more so, the telecoms and ISPs have just been caught smoking gun style supporting astroturfing groups. And I just relate to the experience that we all have in terms of what telecoms and ISPs routinely do. They have a lot of good people working for them and so on, but the deal is that just a couple weeks ago, I asked my cable company, who's also my ISP, to tell me what the meaning of a simple error message was that I was having trying to view some video, because remember, I love TV, and after a half hour to an hour, they couldn't figure out what their own error message meant. And that kind of thing is normal and acceptable, and it goes on worse from there. So it all comes down to what regime can we enforce that involves the least amount of reliance on telecoms and ISPs to be trustworthy. Again, this is about as mundane an issue as I could bring forth. It's about as basic as anything we can do, and yet we keep forgetting about that. And I'm a customer service rep. That's what I think about.
Terrific. Clay, you wanted to jump in and ask a question yourself of Anna, I think it was.
Sorry, I'm unmuting. Yes, that's right. I wanted to go back to Anna's sense of Obama as someone to talk to about these issues, given his campaign promises and given the fact that he came in on a wave in both elections of incredible technical competence around the election. I was struck by that. That is one of the first optimistic things I've heard about that strategy in a while. There is, among certain sections of the tech community, such a demoralization around the Obama administration between the changes on the early changes on the FISA court dating all the way back to 2007, right up to the of-the-moment failure to put together the kind of institution that could make healthcare.gov work until after it had hit its crisis point. So I wanted to ask essentially for a ray of hope, if there is one to be had, Do you think that Obama feels strongly enough about this, or could be persuaded to feel strongly enough about this issue, that he would in fact expend some political capital wading in? And if so, what would it take to get that done?
I think that's a terrific question. I think that's our job, right? Is to make it a big enough issue. And one he can wade into. I would note that President Obama just did something that was a leap in the last few weeks, having his Environmental Protection Agency roll out these new rules regulating emissions from coal-fired power plants, which is arguably, and I think in fact, unless you consider President Nixon's creation of the EPA in the first place, which wasn't supposed to be about climate change, this was the biggest thing that any president has done to tackle climate change, I think, in history. And so he has shown that he can actually take executive action. He can wade into sticky fights even that have consequences for Democrats running in some areas. That's a useful precedent to note, that he can actually do something which is insufficient, but which is a step in the right direction, and which is controversial. And perhaps being in the last 2 years of his presidency is a great moment, as good as we've had, actually, as activists, to press our case. The consequences of inaction right now for him include his own legacy. And will his legacy be that he preserved a free and open internet that allowed the flourishing of our economy and of civic society, or will it be something else? So I think it's a smart strategy to hold President Obama to his campaign promise to protect the free and open internet, to help create this sort of political space to keep Congress from wading in and doing something bad, and to create the political space for Commissioner Wheeler to do the right thing. I would point people towards a member-created petition on our site that has over 60,000 signatures, and all the other sort of flurry of activity that's been happening out here, again, on an issue which we all understand as inherently wonky. We're seeing, I think, more activity on it, including the camping out in front of the FCC in Washington. We're seeing more activity than I think something which is called net neutrality rightly deserves. So I'm optimistic.
Craig, you want to jump in on that quick question, and then we're going to move to strategy questions here. Go ahead, Craig.
Given my work at Veterans Affairs, I've learned that in Washington, everywhere, but particularly in the White House, that no matter what the president says, there are going to be parties in the media who are going to sensationalize it, even if it means exaggerating some things or lying about it. So the president may be in a lose-lose situation until people like us are willing to give him the political cover that he deserves. That's just the environment these days for the FCC as well, and for that matter, everywhere.
Well, why don't we, given that we're kind of already talking about strategy here, Clay, what I thought, do you want to just elaborate a little bit and actually get everyone to kind of maybe talk about this, your two-stage strategy idea, that there's a kind of a realistic way to think about what we can do in the comment period. Maybe could we push enough if people really feel strongly about the public utility option? Is there enough to build that within through the summer, or if not, is there some way to think about a short-term strategy and then a longer-term strategy? I'm just curious, or will it take more political will over time to get the public utility fully shifted in another era?
Yeah.
Talk a little bit about that, because that's really critical here. Where do we put our focus?
I mean, it is certainly clear from the comments of the FCC, and it is certainly clear in the history of the network that it has been run like a utility, albeit without the regulatory framework of one. And for a long time, it looked like a stroke of pragmatic genius not to have the regulatory overhead, but to have essentially a set of peering arrangements that allowed the net to work under some rough and ready version of the end-to-end principle. Plainly, that bargain is breaking down, and although it has been a surprise that it was now and that it was these particular actors. In fact, Andrew Odilska, one of the great economists of network economics in general, has said transportation and communication networks will always go to monopoly rent extraction if someone can get their hands on the infrastructure. So this is a permanent danger of running a network like the internet. and the obvious answer, common carrier, comes with this enormous overhead. It's a technocratic issue. It's being adjudicated on largely economic terms rather than political terms, which is to say the kinds of questions Anna was raising about the democratic polity and participation are not well represented in the FCC's debates and so on. So I don't know, Pete, the answer to your first question, which is there enough force to cause the preference of the people responding to the FCC for common carriage governance? Is there enough force to get that to happen, essentially either in the next 90 days or get it to fail and then get Congress to overturn it in the next, whatever that would be, 150 days? I don't know. The FCC is both commercially captured by the industries it's intended to regulate, and also intentionally as a technocratic agency, somewhat sealed off from political pressure. Although I think Anna's point about Obama doing the bank shot with reaching the president is different than trying to reach out to your Congress people. So Plan A, from my point of view, should plainly be to try to get some form of net neutrality, common carriage regulation under Title II. If we fail, though, it seems to me that we should at this point be thinking about plans B and C. Plan B is to limit the damage that can be done if we fail to get that kind of regulation, so that what looks like reasonable and non-discriminatory terms does as little damage as possible. There will obviously be some damage, especially to startups and insurgents in the video space. They will effectively be locked out of competition without raising enormous war chests in advance. Something like YouTube or Vimeo, Blip could never happen under the new set of regulations. We should be working to figure out how to minimize that. And then C, somebody mentioned early on, I think it may have been Brian, there is plainly a civic model that says a city builds its own last mile, and because it captures local taxes, it effectively becomes the network operator, and you move from a commercially provided to a civic provided model of bandwidth. I don't know if we can have a movement that thinks about plans A, B, and C all at the same time, but I do know if on September 11th we turn out to have failed to convince Wheeler or failed to move the FCC generally, we better be thinking about B and C, which is to say we better be thinking about limiting the damage using what minimal tools we might have from now a fast lane, slow lane, or a network that allows that kind of commercial discrimination. And we should also be pushing hard, really under almost any circumstances, for civic rather than commercial provisioning of last mile bandwidth. Both the economic and the political arguments for that are very clear. It is a different kind of political fight, but it's one where we could potentially make some progress simply because the U.S. is divided up into so many individual jurisdictions, and things like Google Fiber now provide essentially an early test bed. But I, certainly for the next 90 days, most of the rhetoric is going to be around the FCC comment period. But I want us also to be thinking about what do we do if we have to fall back to plans B and C.
Marvin, why don't you jump in with one? How realistic you think is that plan A, and then also the fallback idea? That's interesting from your point of view. You're muted. Sorry, right now.
Okay, so I think we can win on plan A. I think it's a long shot. I think the carriers have a ton of money, a ton of foundations, a ton of advocacy groups, a ton of folks who are at their beck and call, tons of lobbyists, give lots of money to campaigns. They're the only reason why this is a debate, because the future of the internet is the future of everything, every industry, every economy, everything from transportation to payments to education to e-commerce, and all those folks who don't have armies of lobbyists will all be affected and impacted. So I think we have a shot. So I'm working on Plan A at the moment, and Plan A is actually, quite simply, it has to be Title II, and it has to be a non-discrimination rule without fees. I think any characterization of the chairman's proposal or Section 706 is permitting that just isn't reading the Verizon order or the chairman's proposal. You don't need a Harvard degree to understand what's being said in those orders. So I think Plan A is Title II. Plan B, when you think of municipal cities building fiber, very difficult road. A lot of states out there have rules against cities building fiber. There's a lot of protectionism for the existing incumbents like Verizon, AT&T, Comcast. So you have to fight a fight in state legislatures where those guys are extremely powerful. Hopefully we can win. The FCC chairman, one of the good things he might do is try to preempt some of those state laws that are restricting municipalities, right? So, a state will try to keep cities from building networks. I think, cities aren't all that well funded even to do it. So C, which you kind of hinted at, was Google for Google Fiber and other options. I've been trying to slice and dice how this can be done. And, wireless isn't yet a good enough substitute for wireline. And if you're going to build out a fiber network, Google sort of has been very, very smartly cherry-picking the least expensive cities. Kansas City is a city that's sort of mid-density, has aerial instead of underground fiber, all these sort of things that you look at to make it cheaper to build. And even then, you've got to get a huge number of people subscribing to the new entrant. Those are really challenging. And so we've waited for a decade or more for new competitors. I think we should encourage that as much as we can, and there are lots of rules to encourage that kind of competition. But at the very least, we need a non-discrimination rule, a common carrier regime right now to make sure that we're not stifling, companies that aren't only video startups, but all the companies out there that rely on their page loading quickly or their videos loading quickly, or else their competitors will eat their lunch.
Great, that's a good. So, Brian, you mentioned you had a plan B. That'd be interesting.
Oh, no, I just wanted to reinforce both plans B and C. Certainly these plans aren't mutually exclusive. We should push ahead of them. But under whatever authority we might have, or the FCC might have, to be able to head off some of these state-level blockages against the cities or other civic groups being able to build local bandwidth cooperatives, I think that would be a really essential angle to pursue. The city of Palo Alto, may not be known, has had a municipal cable operation for a couple of decades, and not only is it great quality and great service, but it's entirely locally owned. There's examples of these out there, but unfortunately there's many more examples now of states starting to, under pressure from funding, block that. And I wonder if some of the public attention that has been pushed to the FCC, pushing that at states where people feel a bit, I think, of a stronger connection to their state legislators or to their governors than they might to DC, and where actually the dollar amounts to influence the outcomes might actually be smaller. I think there's some positive steps there, but I'm wondering if it's not just about the city government itself, but simply ISPs who are more local. I'm thinking, for example, of SonicNet. Right, SonicNet, which has been rolling out gigabit per second fiber in Sebastopol, wants to come to San Francisco, wants to go to other cities, and faces hurdles that are much more regulatory and political in nature than they are about digging trenches in the ground. Right, and I think we might want to ask, what is it that keeps a much more vibrant local ISP scene from coming back the way that we had it in the 90s, and that helped build a lot of the first wave of internet infrastructure.
Fascinating. Doug, you kind of, even though you plan A, you're opposed to plan A, but in a weird way, your plan is kind of a plan B's in a way. I mean, if you do you see?
Right. Doug's plan is plan B.
Huh?
Doug's plan is plan B, which is to say, accept 706 and use those mechanisms.
Well, Clay, okay, then actually, Clay, since you jumped on that, would that be, I mean, you want plan A, that's great, and I think we're going to go back to that in a second here, but if we got at least what Doug's saying there, is that not a bad plan B, at least that could show that you could actually build off of going forward?
I mean, the thing about that as plan B is you don't have to agree whether it's good or bad. All you'd have to agree is in the event of a loss on the Title II issue, Plan B is one of the plans we've got. And exactly as Brian says, B and C, which is to say, try to keep the regulatory oversight of the FCC from defending us against the worst of the predations from cable companies and telcos, you can pursue that at the same time as you pursue municipal fiber. Those are two very different kinds of countervailing strategies, both in my mind and even in combination inferior to Plan A, inferior to common carrier regulations, but not nothing. And I think if I had to characterize the difference between me and Doug would say Plan B is effectively better than I am imagining and can provide more of what we want at lower cost than I'm factoring in. But I think that certainly the opinion Doug started out expressing was that Plan B is not actually inferior to Plan A in any significant way.
Yeah, I'd also like to point out, I mean, I think an important point that hasn't been brought up, that I'm not sure it's entirely clear that Title II, the original Plan A, can do really all the work that you all want it to. Title II, at least if you think of it in terms of the old school phone regulations, it's clear that all sorts of discrimination is allowed under that. The phrase is slightly different. Under 706, it would be commercially reasonable discrimination that would be allowed. Under Title II, it's unjust and unreasonable discrimination that isn't allowed. But if you think of it in terms of phones, I mean, that allows all sorts of different services. It allows two-sided pricing. You think of like 1-800 numbers, where the businesses on the other end that receive the calls are the ones that actually pay for the call. It allows for radical price discrimination. If you think of it in terms of 1-900 numbers, I mean you can set up all sorts of really discriminatory pricing mechanisms. You can do volume and bulk discounts. You could set up a regime whereby Netflix is forced to pay less or more depending. I mean it's not clear that just by getting Title II we get automatically can outlaw all sorts of discrimination. So just to put that point out there, I think it's important to address it at least. And so I think that I worry that if we focus all of our energies on Title II as a response to ending the worst sort of possible discriminatory or blocking stories that we can imagine, that we end up sort of ignoring the 706, which, I mean, to be honest, I mean, the way that I read the wins in D.C., it seems that 706 is more likely an outcome. And so I think that at least focusing on that possibility and trying to set up those sorts of, like I said, those rebuttable presumptions and things like that as a way to really, on the point of the longer term sort of strategy, I think Clay, Marvin, very very good points. I think community-owned broadband networks are one possibility. I think Google has opened up. Google really deserves a lot of credit for what they've done to explore the ways to really bring the cost of building out infrastructure down. I share Marvin's concerns that I don't think that scales to other providers coming in, or to the extent that will scale out to suburbs or to other cities that have costlier infrastructure. So it's definitely opening up a lot of those ideas and an important first step. But I agree, it's a difficult one to travel.
Marvin, why don't you jump in terms of to what extent you think the analogy to the telephone kind of discrimination that works on Title II. You're muted, Marvin.
Okay, can you hear me now? Okay, great. So the way the law works here is Title II is a law passed by Congress that gives the FCC the authority to enact regulations. So it's almost like it's a permission slip from Congress to the FCC. And the Title II permission slips, the first two of them, which are 201 and 202, the Title II first provision, Title II second provision, say anyone who's a common carrier subject to Title II shall not engage in unreasonable practices and shall not engage in unreasonable and unjust discriminations. Then the FCC defines what that means through regulation. The FCC would say, we think that it's unjust and unreasonable per se for the ISPs to adopt fast lanes and slow lanes and paid prioritization. So that's how you would do it. It can totally be done. The other side is really trying to conflict, and not other folks in addition to Doug. What I hear from the other side very often is that 706 is stronger than we think it is, and Title II is weaker than we think it is. And my analysis is, 706 requires discrimination, requires access fees, You simply can't have a non-discrimination rule under it. That's what the decision said. And Title II is very strong, very robust, gives the FCC tons of tools and authority, and I think it's really necessary. And so I just wanted to sort of clarify that point.
Craig, you had a silver lining idea. Why don't you jump in and go ahead.
Well, my deal is that if some of our best plans don't work, say Plan A or whatever, this might be the triggering cause for a revival of the anti-SOPA, anti-PIPA movement. That's kind of been floundering, I think. People have made a stab at it, but I don't know if anyone's got anything that at least I can believe in. And I think if that movement reemerged, particularly in a durable way, that could lead to all sorts of good efforts.
Well, Clay, actually, I'd like to build off just a question off of Craig's point there about the silver lining. I mean, let's say the comment period you don't pull off Plan A, but that doesn't preclude it later getting reclassified, or does it? If we miss this kind of, or maybe Marvin.
I think it effectively does. I think that one of the things that we inherited from the beginning is that we are a civil we are a nation of common law rather than civil law, which means that the weight of both legislative and judicial respect for facts on the ground is very much more significant than it is in civil law countries such as France. If, in practice, new revenue streams come about from ISPs and especially cable companies being able to extract money from both ends of the pipe, I do not believe we will ever reverse that. It is the mechanism for reversing that is perfectly clear, but so is the mechanism for doing a lot of other things that are also out of political scope in the United States. So I think that it is not de jure impossible that it gets re-regulated, but I think it becomes de facto impossible if large, broadly distributed employers start taxing the pipe at both ends, that the FCC will ever reverse that. Again, I think one of the absent parallels is the SEC, another agency that suffered terribly from commercial capture. The SEC has extraordinary regulatory powers that it largely doesn't use. Effectively, the logic of too big to fail starts to take over these environments. So I'm very pessimistic, despite the fact that there is some later date at which the FCC could reclassify, that will be in practice all but off the table.
Can I just chime in really quickly?
Yeah, I was going to say, go to you. Yeah, I'd like to hear your point on that.
I just want to say, we shouldn't speak like losers, guys. We're going to win. Right? We're told all the time that things are impossible. We were told, we could never have stopped SOPA. If you go back a little bit earlier, we were told, no way there'll be a debate about patent reform because we just had patent reform 2 years ago and we got to the brink of passing patent reform. But we were told in 2006, I remember, there's no way net neutrality was dead then and a bill was going to pass. We were told in 2007, 2008, the Republican FCC would never stop Comcast from interfering with BitTorrent. Over and over, we're told, since I'm an old man, I've been here a long time, we're told all the time we're going to lose and we shouldn't even try to fight. I think we have a shot of winning, and I think Plan A is probably as likely as any other plan at the moment.
Can I say one thing as another old guy who also has seen this, and I'm by no means saying the fight it can't be won, but I want to get from you is, if we miss this, it's almost the flip, it's the opposite. Is this the only chance of doing this? And if so, shouldn't we absolutely everyone redouble their efforts on this? That's, I guess, what I'm trying to figure out.
Yeah. This is our best shot.
Best only shot, would you say? Or is it, and one thing I'll just ask, since you're a legal guy, in the past with the telephone companies or different private companies in past early industries that later became public utilities, were those shifts, they were pulling away profits from those companies at some point? I mean, there were historical precedents of shifting into the utility category, thriving businesses, right?
Yeah, I'm not sure our political system is the same political system as the one we had before, with the impact of money and the power of money. Just looking at how the financial system collapsed, and there weren't really major changes there. I think that even if our infrastructure sort of collapses or goes in the wrong direction, there might not be a time to reverse. But here's why now is the best moment we have. We have a president who has promised and who campaigned on net neutrality. If you watch videos of Obama promising over and over, no fast lanes, we need a level playing field. I mean, he went out to Silicon Valley and said, I will take a backseat to no one in my support for net neutrality. And he was talking about Hillary Clinton, who was running against him as a primary candidate, who was also in favor of net neutrality. He promised this, and he's president at the moment. We've got a chairman appointed by him, 2 Democratic commissioners who have supported net neutrality historically. We've essentially got close to 3 votes on net neutrality at the FCC, and he's going to decide this by the end of the year. If the Republicans, who have not been as favorable on net neutrality, partly because Obama supports it, if the Republicans take the Senate in the fall, or if the Senate, Democrats lose lose seats, it just becomes a lot harder for the FCC to have the political cover they need to do the right thing. And so I would look at this as our last best shot to do it. And I think of this also, the same way I think of freedom of expression. I tend to write about the First Amendment. We'll never solve freedom of expression. There are always issues that come up. There are always, even if we win on Title II, we'll still have to continue the struggle for an open and free internet, because now, internet freedom is freedom, period. And so I think this will continue, but I think more and more people will be engaged. And I do think this is our best shot.
Anna, as someone who's done a lot of campaigns, what's your best case scenario of how this gets done in the next several months here? What are the places to look for to really make this happen?
I mean, I think one thing to sort of put out there that's just a description of the context that we're operating in. If you look at the really quite stunning results from the primary election in Virginia last night that unseated Eric Cantor, I think we are actually we are operating in a broader environment of widespread mistrust of corporate capture and corporate cronyism in our democracy that is actually affecting both the right and the left. A lot of the analysis of last night's election talked about immigration reform as a tipping point issue, but it was clearly not just immigration reform. There was a lot of chatter among Tea Party activists in Eric Cantor's district about the ways in which he was taking money from big corporations and was sort of a client of Wall Street instead of serving the constituents of the district. What I want to lift up there is that we actually have an interesting emergent opportunity as organizers to talk to Americans across the political spectrum about the influence of corporate lobbying in our democracy, in our rulemaking on issues that include, yes, absolutely, the future of the open internet. And so as we are lobbying Obama, I think we should not be restricting ourselves to thinking that this is narrowly an issue that affects progressives. I actually think this is the kind of conversation that folks on the right would be interested in participating as well, and I'm excited to see sort of transpartisan organizing efforts emerge both on this issue and on others yet to come. On how this will play out in the next few months, I mean, I think I really loved how Marvin put it, like that, we should be optimistic. We've done crazy things in the space of internet freedom before. In part, it's because the usual political spectrum breaks down in new and interesting ways, in part because there are powerful new players that have benefited from an open and free flow of information, like Google and others. And so we should be looking to take advantage of those new alliances and those new dynamics and just keep making our voices heard. The thing about grassroots lobbying is that it actually isn't all that surprising or new. A lot of people need to go make their voices heard, and we need to come up with some creative ways of packaging together, stimulating, and then delivering those messages. So that's the work that lies ahead, and this is the period to do it, absolutely. And I'm focused for one on Plan A.
Great. Thanks, Emma. You're muted, Craig.
In things like what's next, I'm pursuing 2 paths myself. One is, now that I'm spending some time in Washington, trying to figure out how things work from the bottom up. I'm just having a lot of quiet conversations with people who may actually have some ability to tilt the conversation. That's FCC and other areas. Now, I'm a nerd. I'm a total fish out of water. What the hell? The people I talked to found their apartments using the website I founded. That should be good for something. Beyond that, I really am looking forward to the emergence of a durable movement that might actually get stuff done beyond this issue. Haven't seen anything that's really, well, I'm not infatuated with anything. I'm not even seriously flirting with any group yet, but I'm looking. And I'll continue to look, and I'll continue to be optimistic.
Brian.
Certainly wearing my Mozilla and EFF hat, we're going to continue to try to navigate the wonky side of this and figure out how to work with all the other organizations in the space to make a consistent ask. But with more of a personal hat on, I'm sitting here going, what would it take for me to be able to share my internet connection with my neighbors? How do I try to get us out of this trap that I think that we've fallen into, where we look at the pipe that comes into our home as being inexorably linked to a company that doesn't necessarily have our interests at heart, right? And so, there's a lot of very promising things out there, from the widespread acceptance of mesh networking technology as a last mile kind of thing, both commercially and nonprofit, to the adoption and spread of personal clouds and kind of the serverless internet kind of concept that BitTorrent and others have kind of pushed. And I'm seeing all these themes as very related to a consumer demand to get out of this trap. And call that Plan D if you want, but I think while we execute on the other plans, I'm very interested in seeing how does the consumer themselves become aware of the problem and able to influence things in a positive direction by deciding where they want to spend, the non-trivial amount of money that they spend today on internet access.
Is there just one thing, Brian, as someone who's done these early kind of internet things, I mean, I've been talking to people who are trying to talk about the mesh internet and kind of rooting around almost like an alternative system. I mean, can you imagine 10 years out a kind of complete workaround that would actually be really almost an alternative thing that we haven't mentioned here in terms of fiber to the curb, that kind of stuff?
Sure, there are neighborhoods today, and it's not just in Silicon Valley or places you might expect, but neighborhoods where neighbors do interconnect using a combination of mesh or simply deciding to share a Wi-Fi network. You see, similarly, you see apartment buildings now in urban areas where people pay for internet connectivity, but it's provided by the building itself, which has it's a single gigabit or multi-gigabit connection. And you see, I mean, like I mentioned, SonicNet, and I think Google. There's positive commercial actors in this space. Not just not all commercial actors are bad entities in this story. And there is a role for the individual open source developers and hackers and others to play as well in opening new doors for this.
Terrific, Marvin. I know we're kind of starting to wind down here, but we're moving at internet time here. Time is close. I mean, if you had to just off the top, you're in the middle of a kind of hive of activity around this. Like, what's the kind of 3 things you'd want to throw out there? Several things that are like the kind of mission critical things that have to happen fast here, and that people who are either watching this or later watching this, the kind of things you can start thinking about that really needs to happen if you're going to hit your Plan A kind of horizon.
So. So the time horizon is folks are filing comments to the FCC by July 15. Then there'll be more comments filed due around September 10. And everyone believes a decision will be made shortly after the election. That's sort of the time horizon, the sort of sprint that we have ahead of us. If I were watching this video, here's what I think is important. I think people should talk about this issue, and they should call their congressman, talk to their neighbors and their distant relatives who live in other parts of the country. I think people should call their congressmen and make their voice heard. I think they should tell their story to the FCC. I think they should figure out creative ways to be involved in ensuring that the internet remains open and free. And so if you are a cartoonist, make a cool cartoon. If you're a singer, write a song that goes viral about the open internet. I just think that this is the kind of, that years from now, if this decision goes the wrong way, people will regret not having had at least written a song in favor of an open internet when there was the opportunity to make an impact.
Fantastic. Clay, we haven't heard from you for a while. So, where are you going? We're coming towards the end here, and what's your thinking of what we've been doing here, and what's needed to be done, and moving in internet time here? What are the next steps to be thinking about?
I mean, you know, I want to address what Marvin said about stop talking like losers. I may be trying to square a circle here. I do think we have a chance to win. I don't want to be unduly depressive. And exactly as you said, certainly 90 days before Sopa Pipa, it looked like it was sewn up, and then we got it unsewn. But I think the question of internet time is one we sometimes ask ourselves too much. You know what Brian was saying about mesh networking. There are some long-term technical responses to the possibility of a non-discriminatory network that are very different from the current struggle that I think we also, you know, at least some of us need to be focusing on. But really, the thing isn't so much that I'm thinking about isn't even so much about internet time as internet organizational styles, which is the people thinking about and acting on this issue are not a battleship, we're a flotilla, right? There are a lot of different strategies going on at the same time. I will co-sign what Marvin said. I will also say that the FCC is unusually focused on business interests in this conversation. And one of the things you can do when filing a comment is if you run or work at a business which as a user of bandwidth would be negatively affected, those comments I think will be especially helpful and especially resonant, precisely because this technocratic issue is being adjudicated, I think, in many of the FCC's minds on economic questions. And no one in DC would add an additional tax onto a business without understanding that there was going to be an effect on that business as a result. I think what we're seeing here is a risk of that tax. But I think the most important thing I'd say is any time spent asking ourselves whether this strategy or that strategy is a good idea is a waste of time, because there is no executive committee of the net neutrality movement. And in fact, one of the things that we've always done well at in these kinds of issues is simply to have multiple strategies going at the same time. I think our current best shot is to convince the FCC that the historic modes of etiquette and peering on the internet are now worth preserving in regulation, now that mere moral suasion has failed to hold taxing both ends of the pipe at bay. But I also think that other strategies like mesh networking, like civic networking, and like looking at restrictions that can be put in place for anti-competitive behavior in 706 are right at the same time, are right to do at the same time. But I will say, I have said, and will say for anybody listening to this now or in its asynchronous mode, if you were ever going to do anything on this issue, now is the time to do it. What will happen in the next 90 days is going to be so momentously much more important than most of the plans B, C, and D, that because this is our best shot at having a sort of settled version of this, if you ever cared about network neutrality, now is the time to act, through comments, through talking to representatives, and frankly through helping make this issue seem salient to people who don't spend a lot of time thinking what goes on the router, but nevertheless use and rely on the internet.
Terrific. Craig, did you want to just think about what would you tell people to do in the last kind of next steps? Any thoughts on that?
I don't have any specifics beyond what I mentioned last time. The only thing is to just keep plugging away, both in the trenches in Washington, despite the humidity, and beyond that, trying to support the groups which may show a chance at an emergent movement. I guess beyond that, I keep reminding people of the basics, which we keep forgetting. Telecoms and ISPs use public property. Are they good tenants of that public property? And if not, what do we do about it?
Good, thanks. Doug, why don't you give a sense of, from your point of view, how this issue is coming to a head? I know you have a little different perspective, but think about what are the issues here to do to really figure this out best.
I mean, yeah, absolutely. Agree with Clay. This is the time to act. And while I'm not sure if I agree on quite the next steps of the direction we've all been discussing, I absolutely agree that it's time for public to weigh in. That this is, these next couple months are the opportunity, and it's incredibly important to remind the commission, remind the FCC, as we talked about earlier, that is used to these very narrow technocratic issues, to remind them that net neutrality is incredibly important to all of us, and an important broader public policy discussion. That this isn't just about these sorts of narrow corporate interests. That there is a legitimate and big sort of public interest in these issues. At the same time, I would encourage anyone who's thinking about filing comments to at least the extent their time allows or their interest allows, to dig in and actually figure out, look at the NPRM, look at the questions that are asked. I think that a lot of the flood of comments that have come in have not been very helpful. I mean, it's good to remind that people care about these issues, but if it's just denigrating the FCC, just attacking Wheeler, I don't think that those are very helpful. That it sort of distracts from the debate and doesn't really help move the ball forward. So I think if for the public at large to comment, keep it clean and reasonable. Yeah.
Anna, we got election parallel to this, which actually we haven't really talked about specifically, the pressure on the Congress, the election. Are there thoughts that you have, including potentially raising this issue in electoral context?
I mean, I think the clear next step for us here, for people who care about the open internet, is to take this very important window, as others have said, of opportunity to make our voices heard as decision makers are weighing precisely what to do. People who care about the future of our democracy, who care about a flourishing discourse, who care about a vibrant economy, an equal playing field for everyone, should care about the future of the internet, about classifying it as a public utility. This is a fight for internet freedom. It's a fight for really taking seriously the problem of corporations who have captured so much of our regulatory regime already, and making sure that that doesn't happen in the context of the internet, where so much of our life is now being lived. And so I think the important thing to happen next is for people to call President Obama, call the White House, call their member of Congress, join Free Press, join Fight for the Future, join Move On, join the organizations that are vital supplements to all the creative individual action out there. We also have a collective action challenge here, which is that we need to be acting together to make our voices heard. And so I think this is it's an important moment to do the very simplest, oldest thing in our democracy, which is to, as a regular citizen, make your voice heard. And I think if we do that, we're going to see the right outcome here. I think we're going to see President Obama be bold. I think we're going to see the FCC take action to sort of put our economy and democracy on the right path. And it will be thanks to the brave, creative, and impassioned voices of millions of Americans.
Terrific, thank you. Brian, last word here.
Not much to add beyond what I think has been a very expansive conversation. I think the key is mobilizing consumer focus on this issue in a way that is incredibly relevant to them, and invest them in not just expressing themselves to the FCC. I agree, now is the time, and through other political channels, but in taking a sense of ownership over this, and whether that's realizing that they do have choices when it comes, in many cases, not all, but in many cases, to last mile, to thinking about having that conversation with their neighbor next door about it, and are there things they can do together.
Terrific. And as we wind out here, let's bring it back to Clay, who started the whole conversation with your kind of 3 questions, how to think about this. I mean, what would you say you might have learned, or what do you think, any evolution in your thinking through the conversation here? Or
I mean, of the 3 things I threw out, the thing that I have found most interesting in this conversation is this question of the goodness of fit of the kinds of tools we have access to the kind of problem we face. I'm very heartened by Anna's sense that the president, having campaigned on this issue, can be brought around, because the president has disproportionate influence, obviously, over the FCC. One of the few political channels that the FCC as a technocracy is not defended from. I don't want to pretend to throw a false blanket of summation over what, as Brian says, has been a fairly wide-ranging conversation. But I do want to echo Anna's statement about this being a collective action problem. And as important, I think, as the kind of classic, person reaching out, file a comment with the FCC, call your representatives, call the president. One of the things that those of us who have been following this issue for a while, I think, have to emphasize is that anyone who understands how important this is and what's at stake and how little time should also talk to friends and family and anyone who uses the internet, anyone who relies on the internet without thinking about it. That effectively the ordinary tools of political action have to be amplified here precisely because it's harder to make our voices heard. And that I think just making it a national conversation, even with all of the varied strategies and so forth, just making it a national conversation will change it, because it will not be viewed simply as a kind of technocratic choice with ramifications for one narrow section of the economy, but really as a momentous political and civic choice for the country as a whole. And it should get the breadth of conversation it deserves, which means that we, and ideally people listening and people following this issue elsewhere, don't just consume what people are saying about it and react in the usual political channels, but also that it becomes a social conversation as well.
Perfect way to end. I appreciate those final comments. Thank you to everyone coming here. Fantastic group gathered. A lot of really interesting ideas. I think we did help move the ball here. We'll be editing this down into various videos, various write-ups the next couple of days, and this is the kind of stuff we can push around. Not much time here. Let's move, and thanks for everyone for coming together, and really appreciate it. And thanks particularly to Clay. Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.